So let's kick off. I'm going to talk for about half an hour, I think, on our perspective on what banks should open source, what they shouldn't, what we think is being open sourced at the minute, and without giving away the whole point of the talk, why we think it's the wrong thing. But before I get into all of that detail, let's introduce myself a little bit, and Adaptive, and who we are, and why we think, well, why I think, because I'm possibly too confident that I have an opinion worth sharing. So Adaptive is a software consultancy. We specialize in financial services, capital and commodity trading markets, and then within that very broad space, which people in the room would know very well, it's sort of fractal, we work in front office real-time trading. So we have built many, many real-time trading platforms over the years since we were founded in 2012. We have offices in London, in the city, in Barcelona, New York, and Montreal. We're about 180 people, or 175 people globally at the moment. So we've grown quite quickly since myself, my name is Matt Barrett, by the way, since myself and three others co-founded the company back in 2012. And we work for a number of investment banks, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3s, in London, New York, and also regional investment banks. We work for market service providers, so liquidity aggregators, exchanges, those sorts of firms building their electronic trading infrastructure. This is sort of the agenda, but it's a very small room. It's just after lunch. If anyone disagrees with me wildly, please just stand up and say so, and we can have a really good debate about it rather than going on and on about it. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we think a bank stack looks like, and show an open source implementation that we have that we use as a sort of a sales tool. I'm going to talk about a little bit what I think competitive advantages to banks and why they would be interested in open sourcing. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we think is being open sourced at the moment, and I might be wrong. My perspective on it might be wrong, and others in the room may have a much different perspective, and it will be really great to hear that. And then I'm going to touch very quickly, and hopefully a bit contentiously, on why we think it's wrong. So we build front office trading applications, and before we started Adaptive, myself and the co-founders were doing a very similar thing, and we were doing it with very expensive vendor products. If you needed to build an FX single dealer platform, like this one, which is now completely open source, you would start off by paying a vendor or multiple vendors $1 million a year to get going, because you needed them to solve a whole bunch of very difficult technical problems that open source community didn't solve, that were beyond your wit and ability to solve internally. So you went to a vendor and you paid them a lot of money. Over the years, that has changed to the point where this thing, which is, as you can see, an FX single dealer platform, bank of adaptive, analytics, streaming prices, a blotter, connectivity to via a WebSocket broker to Google Cloud. All of the back end is written in .NET, running on Linux, so written in .NET Core, running on Linux, written in Docker containers, deployed in Kubernetes, running on a Google container service. It costs, I'm not actually sure it costs anything, to be honest with you. I don't think we get above the minimum usage requirements. It's an FX SDP and it's all open source. That's pretty impressive. The problem is that as we go into different banks and work on platforms that look similar to this, they're not using any open source technology to solve the hard problems. They're building a lot of it themselves. They're still using vendor products. They're spending a lot of money doing the wrong thing. We think as a consultancy that it's, let me lay out my cards, it's good business going in and doing the same thing over and over again. It's pretty boring though. We also don't think that if banks used open source software effectively, and we'll get into what effectively means through the rest of the talk, we don't think that they would spend less. We think they would go further. We think if you're in the room working at an investment bank, I don't think you should think about open source as necessarily a way of reducing your software development costs. You will probably spend about the same, but you will just go further. You'll get a lot more done, and you'll probably be able to differentiate yourself in the market with that effort you're able to spend. And if you think you're good at being a bank, that's probably what you should want to do. So that's this. So this is, as I said, open source on GitHub. Come and chat to me afterwards if you would like that link. But it's just an open source stack that we've written to sort of demonstrate the architectural approaches we use for our clients, since we can't usually yet, fingers crossed, open source all of the work we do for our clients. Hopefully that'll change in a few years. The architecture looks like this. And the reason I'm kind of putting a technical architecture in front of you is because I want to, when we go through the rest of the talk, loop back and touch a little bit on what bits of this are actually competitive advantage to a bank. This is just one diagram of the architecture of the reactive trader. There are dozens of other diagrams you could draw that all show different views on the same thing. They could talk about process, they could talk about tooling, they could talk about the technical layers of architecture and infrastructure that sit underneath all of this. They could talk about a whole bunch of things. This is one view on coupling, and there are other views on coupling. And I think thinking about these things through the lens of coupling is a really interesting way to think about them, because coupling is one of the things that prevents reuse, which is why I think some of what's being open sourced is the wrong thing. So what is competitive advantage for a bank? I think about it as having three layers. The business operating model can provide competitive advantage. The way you do things can also be a competitive advantage. If you have a very open, collaborative, sharing culture, maybe you should have a business operating model that does something with that culture to make you more efficient and more competitive in the market. And you can also, of course, have a technical infrastructure that lets you be very, very agile if, indeed, agility is important to your business operating model. I've been through quite a few agile transformations inside investment banks. And it's quite funny because you have software developers and IT rapidly evolving and trying to become very high velocity, and business sponsors and business stakeholders and business people who actually don't want velocity at all. They're not interested in changing every 2 weeks. They would very happily change once every 12 months. These two organizations don't talk about it and don't seem to come together and meet in the middle at all. So if you have technical infrastructure that gives you agility and a business operating model that doesn't need agility, well, you've created something that isn't very useful. And all that, where things are coupled up and down that stack and where they're decoupled is a very interesting way to think about what you could be open sourcing. So some examples of what I mean here. A business operating model based around latency arbitrage. In that example, technical infrastructure is a pretty clear competitive differentiator. You might be one of the few remaining truly universal investment banks aiming to provide a price and everything to anyone, anywhere in the world. That's a way, that's a business model. You could be deep into product specialization. One of our clients at the moment does the best Aussie Kiwi FX rate in the world. They have lots of clients in Australia and New Zealand. I'm telling you the story because I'm from New Zealand. And they also have a bunch of clients operating internationally, interested in trading that currency because it's very popular in the Kiwi dollar, at least, is in the G10. So those are different ways that a bank's business operating model could differentiate itself. Process and culture is more difficult to identify. We're talking about open source technology, so let's stick to talking about the culture and process around software development. Development models are you can have very, very different development models that get you to the same place. You can have very open and collaborative development models where the software development teams work in an R&D-like fashion, share knowledge, work with each other, are very open to new ideas, emotionally vulnerable. Google has done a lot of research into what makes high-performing teams, and it's all those sorts of things. Or you can have a development model where, I was talking to someone at last night over dinner, where developers walk in the morning, plug in, so to speak, to their computer, put their headphones on, don't really talk to the people alongside them, even though they're all solving the same problem, hopefully going in the same direction, and aren't interested, and you've got a development team made up of individuals. I personally think software development and the delivery of complex projects is a team sport, and if you're doing it differently, you're probably missing out. But you have one of those whether you know it or not, and you have tools to support it, and from those tools you generate software, and that software is coupled to those tools. And you also, of course, have a whole bunch of technical infrastructure that your developers hopefully are implementing to avoid reuse, to avoid everyone generating the same thing. Ideally, you probably maybe have a cross-asset blotter. Maybe you don't. Maybe there's no one in your organization that cares to have such a thing. But you probably have something around messaging, APIs, and ability to describe service contracts, et cetera, et cetera. You most likely have workflow engines, because fundamentally trading is a workflow, and you hopefully have some high availability patterns, or else all of your infrastructure is running on one box and your high availability pattern is hope. And as I was told recently by someone, hope is not a strategy. So why am I talking about this? The point is that these are three different things that a bank has that cause coupling. And when people talk about open sourcing, I think they almost universally talk about open sourcing things that have a clean API or clean boundary when thought of as technical infrastructure. I'm pretty convinced people don't think about the business operating model or the process and culture when they look at a component and think about open sourcing it. And I think that means that what a lot of people are open sourcing is not going to fit anywhere else, is going to be doomed to be an expensive failure, which I think is bad for everyone in the room who believes this is something the industry should get behind. So why do banks open source? Very quickly, I think there are soft reasons why banks open source, and I think that there are hard economic, rational reasons that banks should be open sourcing. And I think a lot of people are doing this. They are looking from New York, from London at least, looking across the Atlantic, looking across America, looking to the West Coast, looking at Silicon Valley, seeing what is happening out there, and thinking that if we open source, we'll end up like those firms. I don't think that is what will happen if you open source without understanding why. Unfortunately, open sourcing internal components, even if you manage to find the right component, is very expensive. And doing it well is time consuming. It opens you up for a lot of criticisms about everything you've done. And that's if you do it right. If you do it wrong, it's even worse. It's a very unpleasant place to have the internet come down on you. No one argues like a technologist, right? To do it well, I think what needs to be open sourced needs to be reusable. And this touches on the coupling. It's very, very easy to spot a clean API. Developers look at it and say, that's a very clean API, that's a good abstraction, we should abstract that component. But the problem is that if it's too close to the business operating model, it's coupled to that operating model, even if you can't see it. And that's really intangible, and I don't have an answer to say how you can spot parts of your technical infrastructure that are really coupled to your business operating model. One way to think about it is that if it's closer to where the trade is done, and you're just thinking about increasing volumes because that's how you make your money, it might deserve some extra thought and careful consideration as to whether it is actually coupled to your operating model. If you have only worked in your organization for the last 15 years, you should not be the person deciding whether or not it's coupled to your operating model, because you're a fish and you don't know that you're in water, which is unpleasant but true. Equally, if it's closer to the culture or the process or the methodology of how you do things, you're also going to have trouble getting any sort of reuse out of it, or other organizations, I should say, will have trouble getting reuse out of it. What's an example of this? Lots and lots of discussion around interop at the moment. Different banks have different ways of thinking about the software they deploy. Some of them have a very top-down command and control mechanism for releasing software. In that world, tight coupling between components is fine, because that's how the organization works. Other organizations who have or would like to move towards a very loose-bound model of developer cooperation and component cooperation would take a different view. But if you just see it as tooling and you don't understand that it's actually very, very coupled to your development process and the way you deliver software, you're going to be a little bit disappointed when other people don't see the genius of what you release, which is obviously a bit of an attack on the ego. Not very pleasant. I'll just, before I move on, there's a great blog post that kind of talks through all the reasons why a free operating open source software project is doomed to fail. Some of these are quite funny. The source code is more than 100 megabytes. I've seen lots of open source banking projects that are bigger than, too big to fit on a floppy disk, as they say. Not really the answer. Anyway, you can find this online. It's quite funny and probably worth a very quick sanity check before you open source your baby. People open source because they think it looks cool, and they also are interested in giving back to the community. Now that's a very good reason to do it. Lots of banks are built on, all technology these days I think is built on open source technology in some part. And if we are trying to be good corporate citizens, much like we're trying to be around the environment or sustainability, maybe we should also be giving back to the open source community. If we look at the top 10 contributors on GitHub, by organisation, it's quite interesting. There's no finance firms here, but I know that very large investment banks have developer numbers rivaling, at least, if not larger, than some of these technology firms. What are they generating with it? Well, I don't know. That's a topic for another day. But the point is that none of them are contributing. But it's not because of numbers. It's because of what they're doing. These firms are cool. They're probably attractive to candidates because of it. And I wonder if because KPIs and policy is such a blunt instrument, I wonder if a bank that said your bonus is going to be decided based on the number of contributors you get in the organisation to be checking into our GitHub repository, what would happen? It would be a very interesting experiment. Not one that I would want to take, but it would be a very interesting experiment. The other, to get onto sort of hard economic rational reasons, one of the things I think that banks are struggling with at the moment is the ability to open source effectively to externalize costs. I think this is something that Silicon Valley does exceptionally well. What do you do? Well, you take an internal capability that you're continuously investing in, but you don't think is differentiating you in the market. That is not something that the IT manager in charge of that project is able to decide. Everyone's pet project definitely differentiates them in the marketplace. You're going to have someone very senior in the organisation take their toy away from them, which will be difficult and painful, but critical for this to work. You're going to need to provide stewardship to build a community, to have it become self-maintaining, and therefore reduce your investment. There's going to be a period of additional investment required. Stewardship doesn't come cheaply, unfortunately. You're going to have to foster engagement, pizza, beer, but also a lot of other more softer things. But hopefully, if you get it right, it will become self-maintaining, and over time, you can reduce your investment and just reap the benefits of having some core part of your infrastructure out in the world with the community, and maybe your competitors maintaining it for you. If we think back to that FX single dealer platform, I think that if we sat down and looked at all the components and thought rationally about it, there is a lot there that what we're using in that FX SDP, that toy FX SDP, are some open source technologies that, to be frank with you, are a bit shit for capital markets engineering requirements, but they're all we have. I know that banks have better infrastructure than many of those open source libraries. They just see it as really competitive. The problem is we see 5, 6, 7 different tier 1 investment banks. They kind of all have the same stuff. You're kind of spending a lot of money that others are spending, and you're not really differentiating yourself with it. It's a bit unfortunate. I think that if we looked at it rationally, we'd be able to identify some things that would be able to be open sourced, which would be very exciting. A very simple toy example, but is very illustrative. One of our clients shared this with us, which was very kind of them. They've recently open sourced a major initiative based on Apache Arrow. And unbeknownst to them, Apache Arrow are now keeping it updated for them. That's quite nice, isn't it? At scale, that becomes hugely effective. Doesn't come easy, doesn't come cheap, but if you start to see these sorts of benefits and rewards, it's obviously reducing your cost and externalizing it. It's not removing the cost. You're literally making someone else do it for you for free. We're all capitalists, right? That's amazing. The other thing that you can get out of this is greatly reducing your hiring or training costs. If you can get an open source component to have hugely wide adoption, that means that you can hire people that know your tech stack before they walk in the door. I already think that most technologists, maybe I'm overstating it, a lot of technologists inside an investment bank don't know how a bank makes money, and the bank doesn't really care. What they want those technologists to have, however, is, for some reason, financial services experience. They don't really need financial services experience because they don't know how the bank makes money. What they need is technology experience in the right technology. And if we could decouple those things, you'd find that investment banking had a much bigger hiring pool to employ people from. A much bigger hiring pool would probably reduce costs. I'm a software developer. Is this really what I'm aiming for? But you know, it's a benefit to the industry overall, I think. I also think that if you are hiring people that understand the tech stack, your time to productivity will be much, much lower. You will get return on bringing new people into the organisation far faster. And one of the things that is incredibly effective in generally improving the overall quality of the ecosystem is people moving from different organisations and cross-pollinating ideas. There's a lot of resistance in certain firms that we know of to bring new people into core teams because they'll take a year and a half to get up to speed. It's a year and a half because it's so arcane. If you could somehow reduce that level of obscurity, you would get the benefits of cross-pollination without paying the cost of the time to productivity. And the other point is that from a hiring perspective, if you suddenly have developers contributing pull requests or interacting with your open source community, you've pretty much gone through a hiring process already, which is incredibly effective. I know that at Adaptive we have people engage with the various open source contributions we make, and we find those people to be hugely motivated, fantastic consultants that then want to come and work for us, and it's really effective. Oh yes, this is, and the other point I think would be that everyone knows banks are competing with Silicon Valley for talent out of universities. Those graduates are going because it's comparatively well paid, often better paid if you're doing AI and machine learning. But it's also what they know. It's really visible. Graduates look at the world of software as they come out of university and see Netflix, Google, Facebook, etc. They see their projects and they gravitate to working either on those projects or working for those companies. Banks just don't have a visibility or a presence there, and it's a real shame. I firmly believe that capital markets engineering problems are really, really interesting and also still relatively unsolved. But unfortunately, students want to go and do other things. We opened an office in Barcelona a couple of years ago, and it isn't a market with a lot of financial services or capital markets history, and we compete with, you know, online pet stores for talent, which I think is a real shame that they sort of see investment banking and financial services as boring engineering. I think an online pet store is pretty boring, but there you go. So the other thing you can do with open source, if you are doing it very well and thinking very strategically about it, is that you can change the way the market operates overall. There's a fantastic series of blog posts, talks from a bit of a character, a guy called Simon Wardley, who I would encourage you all to go away and follow and read and understand a little bit more about technology strategy. It's very, very interesting stuff. He talks about the evolution of capability in the form of software from being custom built to becoming utility or a commodity, and sitting in the middle of that evolution is product. Most of what banks do is custom built, but if they could force it through product, i.e. not suddenly get trapped in having to pay a vendor for all this really expensive, pay a vendor a lot of money for a capability and move it straight to utility, they would free up a huge amount of economic capacity to do very innovative, differentiating things on top of that. I think that's really interesting. That goes back to the point I was making about all the web push real-time messaging that we see banks putting into their FX single dealer platforms. If there was just a standard way to do it, maybe FX single dealer platforms wouldn't all look the same. Wouldn't that be refreshing? So what do we see as being open source? Probably doesn't surprise you. I've kind of told you this all the way through. We think that what's getting open sourced at the moment is frequently coupled to internal technical infrastructure, although that's the least worst of all the problems. We think that things are very, very coupled to a bank's cultural or procedural environment, and I think the big challenge there, as I mentioned, is that the individuals doing the pushing for the contribution are like fish. They don't understand that the process that they're following isn't universal, that there are other banks who do things differently. That means the tooling they've bought, the work that they've built, I should say, the workflow they go through, even from the way they talk to the business, engineer requirements, develop and deliver software, because all of that is fundamentally supported by tooling these days, is different at other organisations, and they struggle to see it. And then the other thing that we see things as being very coupled to, and this is the hardest to spot, is a bank's operating model. Hang on. But it's not that open sourcing doesn't generate zero value. I mean, there's a cost to it, so you have to make sure that there is some benefit to it, but you do get the softer benefits from it, and I think we have to start somewhere. So I would definitely not, I'm not saying stop, don't do anything, I'm just saying think. We definitely want to start walking down this road altogether, and I think something like FINOS is a great place to obviously discuss all of that stuff. What do we think? So why don't we think that's right? Or I look to Silicon Valley for inspiration, possibly naively. What we see Silicon Valley firms doing is open sourcing either a layer of their business process or a layer of technical architecture. Sometimes they encourage a business to be built around it, and in doing so they often add gasoline to the adoption process by really, really drumming up a community around it. Like Silicon Valley marketing firms for developers are exceptionally good at drumming up interest. It is terrifying how you can take a obscure, arcane technical product like React when it was released from very low visibility to one of the most popular UI frameworks in the course of about 2.5 years. Anyone in retail, anyone in any other sort of in any other space would kill for that sort of ability to penetrate a market with a new idea. So they are very, very good at it. But in doing so, in generating that involvement, that engagement, they are in effect externalizing costs. Facebook can hire React developers very, very cheaply now because there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them. They've massively increased the supply of a core constraint on their business model. But what's interesting about, I think, and there's something wrong with this slide, if anyone figures it out, stick their hand up and tell me. These are some open source projects that have come from different famous organizations. What's interesting about them is that none of them have anything to do with the business. They're just a layer of their technical architecture. In fact, most of those are wrong. I've switched them around. That's what they've actually released. And unless you really knew the open source technology landscape, you wouldn't have been able to tell. You could have gone and looked at React and not really known that it had come from Facebook. I think that's really key. That kind of tells you that what they're open sourcing isn't coupled to their organization, to their technical infrastructure, or to the way they go about running their business. I think you can tell at the moment what's being open sourced by banks, where it came from, which I think is a smell. So I think we need to do things differently. I think that we need to take a view top-down, what to make a utility and where to compete and differentiate. Now, I'm not saying that banks should form a monopoly, but I am saying that forums like FINOS are the right place for different banks to get together, be open about what they're doing internally, be open about how much they're spending on what your competitors are spending. Because I can tell you, we are working for a number of you, and you're spending a lot of money on very similar things. I think banks should open source their plumbing. We think about it as, so Adaptive has some IP core infrastructure that we build our trading platforms on, and we try to keep that as below the line plumbing that our clients don't care about, and everything they would talk to us about, sort of above the line code, is when we deliver for them, they own. But the point is that banks need to understand what is below the line plumbing that they don't care about, that doesn't differentiate, and they should open source and build an ecosystem around it. And beyond building an ecosystem around it, they should try to make sure that that ecosystem is commercially viable. They should try to encourage the formation of an ecosystem that itself generates revenues through service and support, one example, or through other mechanisms. But that ecosystem needs to become self-sustaining for the long-term benefits to accrue. And it's also, I think, key for an ecosystem to form, and people may disagree with me on this, that what gets open sourced should be fit for the capital markets world. I see, or we see, I should say, a lot of Silicon Valley technology getting picked up by investment banks and used in a front office trading environment, which is what we're most familiar with, that really shouldn't be there because it is built for a very, very different set of engineering constraints that isn't obvious on first blush, but will become very obvious when you have an outage and lose 2 days worth of trades. I think banks should focus on what they do well and what differentiates them from the rest of the sort of sectors in the world, and figure out what is core to that isn't like everyone else, but is common across all the different financial services players, and open source that. Because it may not be the case, and it may not be the case that those pipes, that plumbing, has utility for other industries. We could also talk about regulation, which is kind of what you would expect people to say. We are being pushed towards an ever-increasing amount of standardization. I think that there's an opportunity to do something interesting there in various places. We were engaged last year in a mutualized consortium to solve some MiFID II, sorry for mentioning the word, requirements, which worked well in terms of shared cost, and now the consortium has drifted apart, which is a shame. But the idea that you could come together around a very clear needed requirement and be quite egoless about the fact that we all have to solve this problem together. 5 minutes? I think that's really important. And if we could just take what we learned from doing it for regulation, we might be able to solve some real problems and save some money on other areas that we don't think of as shared need, but actually are. And last slide. We were talking about this internally and thinking about what the different evolution, what an evolution could look like. I think there's a huge amount of closed source software development that goes on. That's the traditional model and what people have been doing for a very long time. Most firms outside of financial services, I think, are very happy implicitly contributing to open source projects without even really thinking about the regulatory and compliance or legal sides of it. I hope that doesn't blow up in their faces and set us all back 10 years, but that's what they're doing. There's mutualization, which is what I just mentioned on, getting several firms together to pool cost. It's difficult because you need to get them all to agree to go in the same direction. Then you need to keep them all in their jobs for 18 months to get you there. So lots of things need to go right. You have the ability for firms to get together to create a shared service as an external vendor, as an external platform, a utility, if you will. That's very interesting. And we've seen quite a few examples of that. In the past, the technology doesn't end up open source, but you get this sort of shared service utility player into the market. I think anyone doing it now would need to open source the technology platform and sell service and support on top of what they open source as the business model. And then, of course, there's just a full open source model where potentially previous versions of your core infrastructure get released. Google does this really well. Google is now on a few generations ahead of what they last released to the world. They do quite a good job of open sourcing what was cool for them last year, and the whole world picks it up because it's so far in the future that it's sort of unrecognizable. But they drive a huge amount of goodwill without really giving away their core competitive advantage. And they also do a great job of building ecosystems around their products, which is really good to see. There we go. Thank you very much for listening. Anyone would like to tell me I'm completely wrong? Yeah, please.
On your slides about what we need to do differently,
yeah.
Do you think that Symphony and what Boulder did with Symphony, the way they did that was a good example of that? Did that fit your...
What a loaded question.
I can ask it less loaded. I don't mean to be loaded.
No. I would say what was it the Chinese philosopher said about the French Revolution? It's too soon to tell. I don't actually. I think it's really too early to tell. I think that process has been good. We see a lot of interest and excitement in our clients. A good leading indicator is that 4 years ago, clients were asking us to build chat into the things we built for them. No one is asking us to build chat into the things they're building them. They're asking us to integrate with Symfony. So based on the points I'm making, then yeah, it seems to be working well. And we would rather integrate with Symfony than build another chat application. Definitely. Yeah?
In terms of, you were saying, in terms of having an egoless approach,
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether institutions or things like trade associations or bodies, industry bodies, can play a role in making that happen.
I think so. I think that it requires an industry body to lead rather than support or follow, which is far from simple. I think that industry bodies who are funded by their members are often a little bit scared of leading too strongly and taking their members where they may not want to go, even if it's good for there's like a local optimization versus a global optimization problem. But I think in general, yes, you make a very valid point.
I have a question. This goes back to the coupling discussion. How much of you do you think that that's just because business processes have been built around systems versus systems being built around business processes, or do you see that that's kind of the issue?
I think it comes back to I'm sure you've heard of Conway's law.
Yeah.
I think it's that.
You just see the organization bleed through the architecture
Yep.
of the systems. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see over the years we've seen many internally built trading platforms all take a slightly different approach to solving very similar problems. And the differences are often due to the organizational structure that built them. Some have, depending on how far up as a really trivial example, depending on how far up the organizational tree you get to someone who's responsible for example, fixed income and commodities, you go to the IT side of the fence and you map it down to where they end up on a shared stack. And it's just like a one-to-one isomorphism, right? I think it's largely that.
Any thoughts on combating that?
No, but if I could figure that out, I'd sell that.
Yeah, fair enough.
Unfortunately, I'm sorry.
Here's the magic box, open it up.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Cool. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for listening.